Shadows linger in places meant for joy, and even in a room filled with music and golden light, cruelty can slip through disguised as laughter. The night was meant to celebrate love, yet whispers sharpened into daggers, and the weight of silence pressed heavier than the sound of any insult. What no one knew was that the very thing mocked most bitterly held the power to silence the room and change the meaning of everything. Every wedding carries secrets, some small, some dangerous, and some so unexpected they unraveled the very fabric of pride. This one began with arrogance strutting across polished floors, convinced wealth and status ruled the evening. But dignity, though quiet, is patient. And when dignity rises, it exposes what arrogance tries hardest to bury. Stay with me as we unfold this story. Subscribe now so you don't miss the rest. Give this video a like to help share the message, and drop a comment about the moment you believe will turn the entire plot upside down. I also want to know where you're watching from, because together we create a community that spans far beyond this single story. The wedding reception shimmered with chandeliers, music from a live quartet, and the soft hum of conversation, but beneath the polished surface lingered an undercurrent of pride and arrogance. The bride's family had spared no expense on this evening, determined to show Atlanta society that their daughter had married into love and into respectability. The room was filled with gowns and sequins, tuxedos pressed to perfection, and jewels that sparkled under the light. Among all the glittering displays of wealth, one figure stood apart. Seated at the back of the room, her posture straight and her hands folded neatly in her lap, was the groom's mother, a black woman of quiet strength. She wore a dress that clearly belonged to another era, its fabric faded in places, its design modest, almost plain, compared to the extravagance around her. It was not ugly, but it was old, and in a room where appearance was everything, her presence drew eyes. At first, the comments came in whispers, passed behind champagne glasses. A cousin from the bride's side leaned toward her sister and gestured subtly toward the groom's mother. "Do you see that?" she whispered with a smirk. "That's the best she could do? She's dressed like it's a church revival, not a wedding." The sister snorted, covering her mouth to muffle the laugh. "That dress looks like it came from a thrift store. I can't believe she didn't feel embarrassed walking in here." The whispers grew legs, carried from one relative to another. Each comment sharpened, the laughter growing bolder. Soon an aunt, her voice far less subtle, remarked aloud, "I swear that dress belongs in a thrift store, not at a wedding." Her words floated across the ballroom, cutting through the string quartet's delicate notes, and drew a ripple of quiet chuckles from those within earshot. Not everyone laughed, some shifted uneasily, glancing away as though embarrassed, but no one challenged her. The cruelty passed unchecked. The groom, standing across the room in conversation with friends, heard the remark and turned sharply, his eyes finding his mother. She had heard it too, but she remained still. Her face did not flinch, her gaze did not waver, her dignity intact despite the insult. She adjusted the edge of her dress with deliberate care and returned her eyes to the stage where her son would soon stand. For the groom, her calm was unbearable. He felt the sting of humiliation as though the insult had been directed at him. Rage simmered in his chest, and his fists curled at his sides. He wanted to storm across the room, to silence the mockery, to force them to respect the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. But then his mother's eyes met his, and for a fleeting moment she sent him a message without words. Hold your ground, but not with anger. Dignity, not noise. Her look reminded him of the lessons she had taught him since childhood, when life in their neighborhood had been unforgiving and respect often denied. She had told him then that true strength was not in the shout, but in the silence that refused to bow. Still, the sting of the words remained, hanging heavy in the air. More relatives joined the cruel chorus. "She should have rented something decent for tonight," one muttered. "It's embarrassing for him," another added. "I bet they don't have money. You can see it right there on her back." The groom's jaw tightened. He knew what they were really saying. They weren't mocking just the dress. They were mocking where he came from, mocking his mother's blackness, her refusal to play by their shallow rules of wealth and status. To them, she was an intruder in their carefully polished world, and they wanted to remind her she did not belong. The bride noticed too. She stood radiant in her ivory gown, the picture of beauty and grace, but her smile faltered when she caught sight of the whispers and smirks directed at her new mother-in-law. For a moment, her brow furrowed, shame pricking her as she saw her family's arrogance spill into cruelty. She wanted to speak, to stop it, but her own mother touched her arm gently and whispered, "Don't let little things ruin the night. Smile. This is your moment." So the bride forced her lips back into a smile and turned to greet another guest, burying her discomfort while the mockery spread. The groom's mother remained silent. She sipped her water, nodded politely to those who greeted her, and never once let her composure crack. She had learned long ago how to endure insults disguised as jokes, how to carry herself with quiet dignity in rooms that tried to diminish her. To those who mocked, she appeared weak, too timid to fight back. But those who knew her, her son, the few friends she had confided in, understood that her silence was not weakness but a shield. She was protecting more than herself. She was protecting the moment for her son, yet behind that shield, something flickered in her eyes. Not anger, not shame, but a glimmer of knowing. As though the laughter did not reach her because she carried a truth far heavier, a truth stitched into every fiber of the dress they mocked. Top shelf liquor, imported flowers, 3 tiers on that cake, every detail chosen with perfection, he said loudly, ensuring those nearby heard that the extravagance had come from his wallet. His words were not about hospitality, they were about ownership. He wanted everyone to remember who was in charge, who had power, who had class. The bride's uncle circled the room as if inspecting their work, commenting on the quality of the food, the artistry of the decorations, the sheer size of the ballroom. They compared it to other weddings they had attended, always declaring this one superior, always sliding in remarks about the bride's family setting a standard others could not reach. Guests nodded politely, some with forced smiles, while others grew weary of the endless boasting. The focus of the evening was supposed to be love, the union of 2 people, but the bride's family had turned it into a performance of wealth, a parade of superiority. At their table, the groom's mother sat quietly, enduring each new remark. When the bride's cousin stopped by and glanced at her with disdain, his comment was cruel and direct. "It's a shame," he said with a laugh, "that all this beauty is wasted next to someone dressed like she just walked out of a church basement." The words sliced through the air, and though he said them with a grin, everyone knew the insult was intentional. He wanted to reduce her, to cut her down in public, to remind her that in this space she was out of place. The groom clenched his fists under the table, his anger nearly boiling over. His mother placed a hand lightly on his arm, her touch grounding him once again, a silent reminder that his rage would only feed their cruelty. Still, he could see the pain flicker across her eyes, a pain she tried desperately to mask with calm. Other relatives from the bride's side joined in, praising the dressmakers who had designed the bride's gown, the florist who had arranged the centerpieces, the chefs who had crafted the meal. But the praise was not simple admiration, it was ammunition. Every compliment was a weapon turned against the groom's family, a subtle reminder that they had not contributed, that they did not belong in this sphere of luxury. The bride overheard some of the comments and felt shame prick her again, but once more her relatives leaned in, whispering to her not to let outsiders ruin her special day. She nodded weakly, trapped between loyalty to her husband and fear of alienating her family. The music swelled as the quartet shifted to a new melody, but even the notes seemed drowned beneath the arrogance on display. The bride's family filled the room with their voices, dominating the atmosphere, their words heavy with condescension. Guests began to notice the imbalance, the way one side of the family sought to elevate themselves by diminishing the other. Some whispered that the boasting was unbecoming, others exchanged looks of discomfort, but most chose silence. After all, few were willing to challenge a family that wore their pride like armor. The groom's mother remained silent, though every comment seemed aimed like an arrow in her direction. She did not rise, she did not argue, she simply endured. To some, her silence seemed like submission, but to her son, it was strength. He knew her story, the sacrifices she had made, the battles she had fought, the way she had carried him through life with dignity, even when the world tried to deny them respect. She had taught him long ago that arrogance was a fragile mask, that true worth never needed to be shouted from a stage. Still, as he watched his in-laws flaunt their wealth and mock his mother openly, his heart ached. He knew they saw him differently now too. They looked at him as if he had risen above his station by marrying their daughter, as if he were lucky to have been chosen, as if his worth was measured only by their acceptance. The truth was that they did not see his mother's dress as fabric. They saw it as evidence of inferiority, a symbol of their imagined superiority. And though his mother bore the insults with silence, he could not forget them. He vowed quietly that their cruelty would not define the night, nor would it define his mother's place in this family. The mocking whispers about the black groom's mother and her old dress had not faded. Instead, they hovered in the air like smoke, reminding everyone of the cruelty that had already been spoken aloud. The bride's family remained at the center of the noise, their voices louder than others, filling every pause with a boast or a thinly veiled insult, as if their arrogance could erase the unease that had settled over some of the guests. At one of the side tables, however, something quieter unfolded. A woman in her 70s, not related to either family but invited as a longtime friend of the groom's employer, walked over to the groom's mother and introduced herself. Her voice was gentle, her smile warm, and unlike the sharp glances that had been cast all night, her eyes held no judgment. She leaned in slightly and asked softly about the dress. "It's unusual," she said kindly. "The stitching, the way it falls, it feels like something with a story." The groom's mother lifted her eyes and for the first time that evening allowed a hint of expression to break her composure. It was not joy and it was not sorrow, but something in between, something heavy yet treasured. She offered a small smile, her voice measured and calm. "It's been in my family for generations," she replied, her words chosen carefully, nothing more than that. The kind stranger nodded, accepting the answer without pressing further. She seemed to sense that there was more to the story, but she respected the mother's silence. She patted her hand gently and returned to her seat, leaving behind only a moment of humanity in a night otherwise drenched in cruelty. The groom had seen the exchange from across the room. He knew what his mother meant. He knew that her vague reply was not a dismissal, but a shield. She carried history in that dress, and history was not for everyone to know, certainly not for those who mocked without understanding. The dress was more than fabric, more than stitches. It was blood and memory, survival and legacy, but for now she guarded that truth with silence. At the head table, the bride shifted uncomfortably. She had caught the moment too, had seen the kind guest lean in with respect and her mother-in-law respond with quiet dignity. The bride's heart twisted, torn between the love she felt for her husband and the loyalty demanded by her own family. She wanted to rise, to defend the woman who had raised the man she now called husband. But as soon as she opened her mouth, her cousin leaned close and whispered, "Don't make a scene. It'll ruin the mood." Another aunt touched her arm, smiling at guests as she hissed quietly, "This is not the time to be sentimental. Keep smiling. Don't embarrass us." The bride froze, her voice swallowed before it could escape. She forced her lips into a smile, her eyes darting toward her groom who was watching her closely. Their eyes met across the room and, for a heartbeat, he could see the conflict tearing through her. He knew she felt the sting of her family's cruelty. He knew she wanted to speak, but he also saw her hesitation. It was not malice that kept her quiet, but fear. Fear of going against the people who had shaped her, fear of breaking the delicate balance of a night meant to celebrate. The groom looked away, disappointment gnawing at him. He had hoped she would be different, hoped she would stand beside him, but her silence cut just as deeply as the laughter of her relatives. Meanwhile, the groom's mother remained the picture of composure. She took small sips of water, adjusted the small clutch on her lap, and nodded politely when spoken to, but inside she was steadying herself against the tide of judgment. She had faced worse than whispers at a wedding. She had endured years of people telling her what she could not be, of doors closed because of the color of her skin, of opportunities denied not because she lacked talent, but because she was black in a world that often treated black women as invisible. Compared to those wounds, tonight's insults were shallow scratches, but still they stung because they came on the night her son should have felt nothing but joy. Guests from the groom's side noticed too. An older cousin frowned deeply, muttering to his wife that he hated the arrogance of the bride's family. A childhood friend of the groom shook his head and whispered that respect was more valuable than any display of wealth. They did not rise to confront it, but they felt the injustice boiling just beneath the polished surface. The bride's relatives carried on as though nothing had happened, clinking glasses, raising toasts to themselves, and boasting about how the night was the pinnacle of elegance. They did not notice, or perhaps did not care, that their words had become daggers to the woman they mocked. They mistook silence for weakness, mistook composure for shame, and mistook dignity for surrender. They believed they had won, but they had no idea that their arrogance was building toward a reckoning they could not yet imagine. They wanted to remind him that in their eyes, his family had no class, no wealth, no worth compared to theirs. It burned inside him like fire, and he could feel his chest tighten with every cruel word. His bride sat next to him, her hand resting gently on his, but it did little to soothe the rage building in his heart. He had dreamed of this day as a celebration of love, a blending of families, a moment where his mother could hold her head high and be recognized for everything she had given him. Instead, she was being laughed at like a prop in someone else's show, treated as though her very presence was a blemish on their perfect evening. He wanted to rise, to confront them, to let every arrogant relative know that their cruelty had not gone unnoticed, but just as he leaned forward, his mother's hand touched his arm. Her grip was gentle but firm, a quiet force that pulled him back from the edge. He turned to her, his eyes filled with fury, but she shook her head softly. "This is your day," she whispered, her voice steady. "Don't let them take it from you." He froze, her words slicing through the haze of his anger. She was the one being mocked, the one enduring the humiliation, yet she was the one calming him, protecting him, making sure his night was not overshadowed by their cruelty. He felt both awe and anguish, ashamed that she had to shoulder the weight of dignity while he sat paralyzed by rage. The music swelled, the waiters passed more glasses of champagne, but the atmosphere remained poisoned by arrogance. Laughter rang out from the bride's side of the family, louder than before, each joke building on the last. They thought they had silenced him with their superiority, thought that his mother's quiet endurance was proof that they were right. It was then that a brother-in-law, emboldened by wine and the approval of his relatives, raised his voice for the whole table to hear. "Anyone dressed like that," he said with a mocking laugh, "must not have anything valuable in life." The words hit like a slap, echoing across the ballroom. The groom's eyes darkened, his body tense, his breath sharp. Guests nearby turned their heads, some gasping softly, others looking away in discomfort, but no one spoke. The arrogance of the bride's family had crossed a line, and everyone knew it. The groom pushed back his chair slightly, ready to stand, but once again, his mother's hand pressed gently on his. Her eyes met his, calm yet firm, carrying the weight of decades of resilience. "Not tonight," she murmured. "You don't fight shadows with shadows. Let them laugh. They don't know what they mock." He clenched his teeth, torn between his instinct to defend her and his respect for her wisdom. Her voice reminded him of the lessons she had given him growing up, lessons born from years of walking into rooms where respect was withheld, where her presence was questioned, where she had to carry herself with dignity no matter what was thrown at her. She had told him then that fighting back in anger only fed the cruelty, that true strength was found in knowing your worth even when others tried to deny it. Still, the humiliation burned. His bride's silence cut him too, her family's cruelty unchallenged by the woman who had promised to stand with him through anything. He could see the shame in her eyes, the guilt she tried to bury beneath her smile, but she did not speak. She was trapped, torn between her husband and the family who had raised her, and her silence was louder than any defense. Around the room, guests shifted in their seats. Some from the groom's side looked ready to speak, but they too stayed quiet, bound by the fear of turning a wedding into a public confrontation. Others from the bride's side laughed along with the insult, their arrogance feeding on itself, blind to the damage they were inflicting. The groom sat frozen, his mother's hand the only thing holding him in place. He wanted to scream, wanted to tear down their pride with the truth of who she was, but she would not allow it. She had chosen silence, chosen dignity, chosen to endure for the sake of her son's joy. She had always carried him, even now, when she should have been the one protected. Inside, the groom vowed that her silence would not be in vain. He promised himself that the truth of her worth, the truth of what she carried in that dress, would one day be revealed, and when it was, their arrogance would collapse under the weight of it. For now, though, he remained seated, his anger tempered by her calm, his strength drawn from her quiet endurance. She had calmed her son when he was ready to burst, endured a brother-in-law's humiliating remarks, and remained composed in the face of cruelty. Still, not everyone in the room was blind to her struggle. Some guests from the groom's side sat stiff and quiet, their eyes betraying their disapproval. The bride, though radiant in her gown, shifted uneasily at her table, each new laugh from her relatives deepening the knot in her stomach. The groom's mother seemed untouched by it all, but her silence was not emptiness. It was measured, intentional, and behind her calm eyes flickered something the others could not see. The first clue to that hidden truth came from the most unlikely source. During a pause in the festivities, when the music softened and guests drifted toward the buffet tables, the youngest flower girl from the bride's side wandered near the groom's mother. She was a curious child, no older than 7, her hands restless with the need to explore. While the adults were distracted with laughter and wine, the girl tugged lightly at the edge of the older woman's dress. At first, it seemed innocent, a child's fascination with fabric. But then her small fingers brushed against the seam and found something odd. She frowned, tugged again, and whispered with a mixture of surprise and delight, "There's another layer under here." The words were quiet, but to the groom's mother, they landed like thunder. She looked down quickly, her eyes sharp yet calm, and gently pulled the dress back into place, covering the section the child had touched. "Careful, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice warm but her tone final, the kind that carried authority without raising in volume. The little girl blinked up at her, confused but obedient, and skipped away toward the dessert table, leaving behind only a trace of discovery. The groom's mother adjusted the fabric carefully, her fingers smoothing the line as though erasing evidence of the interruption. Her face remained composed, but for the first time that night, her eyes carried something firmer, a flash of urgency beneath her calm. She had been willing to endure their mockery, willing to remain silent as their arrogance spilled over, but the touch of a child's hand had nearly revealed more than she was ready to show. The groom, who had been watching from across the room, caught the moment. He saw his mother's swift movement, the way her hands moved with precision, the way her expression shifted for just an instant before returning to calm. He frowned, curious, unsettled, wondering what exactly she was protecting. He had always known there was more to the dress than faded fabric. She had guarded it for years, wearing it only on rare occasions, never explaining more than that it belonged to her family. Tonight, under the weight of laughter and judgment, he began to wonder if the truth of that dress was far greater than even he had imagined. The bride's family, of course, noticed nothing. They were too busy congratulating themselves on the grandeur of the evening, raising glasses to their own success and whispering smugly about how the groom had married into a family far above his means. They believed the dress was nothing more than proof of inferiority, an easy target for their ridicule. They did not see the way the groom's mother's fingers lingered on the fabric after the child left, or how her eyes flickered toward her son, silently reassuring him that all was well while hiding something deeper. Guests seated nearby, however, caught the tension. An older cousin of the groom leaned toward his wife and whispered, "Did you see that?" She covered the dress like it was something valuable. The wife nodded slightly, her gaze fixed on the older woman. "They don't know who they're mocking," she replied quietly. "There's more to her than they can see." Across the room, the bride felt her stomach twist again. She had been watching too, and though she could not hear the child's words, she saw the movement, saw the way her mother-in-law had shielded the fabric with such deliberate care. For the first time, the bride's unease shifted into curiosity. She began to suspect that the old dress her family mocked so freely might not be what it seemed. Yet she said nothing. Fear still bound her. Fear of standing against her relatives, fear of ruining the illusion of harmony. The groom sat rigid, his mind racing, his heart pounding with the weight of unspoken questions. He wanted to go to his mother, to ask her what she was hiding, to demand to know why she guarded the dress so carefully. But he knew the time was not right. She had chosen silence, chosen patience, and if there was one lesson she had taught him, it was that truth revealed itself at the right moment, not before. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to endure, even as the weight of curiosity pressed heavier on him. Meanwhile, the bride's family carried on as if nothing had shifted. They laughed, they mocked, they boasted, their arrogance filling the room like smoke. They had no idea that their cruelty was brushing dangerously close to unraveling a secret that would change everything. They believed they had defined her with their insults, reduced her to nothing more than an old woman in a faded gown. They did not know that the dress they dismissed as worthless carried a legacy stitched into its very seams, a legacy hidden in the folds of fabric the flower girl had nearly exposed. The groom's mother smoothed her dress one final time and lifted her chin, her expression calm once more. The laughter had already been cruel, the whispers sharp, and the arrogance unbearable, but as the evening pressed forward, the bride's relatives felt emboldened by their own audacity. They believed they had reduced the black groom's mother to a shadow at her own son's wedding, sitting quietly in her faded dress while they flaunted their wealth and ridiculed her presence. What they failed to understand was that every insult was building tension like a string pulled tighter and tighter, preparing to snap. The music softened as the MC invited family members to share stories and toasts about the couple, a tradition meant to bring joy and connection. Guests lined up near the microphone, some with heartfelt messages, others with lighthearted anecdotes about the bride and groom. The atmosphere seemed to brighten, the cruelty momentarily forgotten, until a cousin from the bride's side stepped forward. He was known in the family for his jokes, his sharp tongue, and his tendency to push boundaries. Fueled by wine and the encouragement of those around him, he adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and began with what seemed like harmless banter. He teased the groom about his first attempts at dancing, poked fun at the bride's obsession with taking photos, and drew laughter from the crowd. But then, with a smirk spreading across his face, he turned his attention toward the groom's mother. "And can we talk about that dress?" he said loudly, pointing toward her as the room shifted uncomfortably. "I mean, Lord have mercy, I thought we were at a wedding, not a funeral." Laughter erupted, harsh and unrestrained, filling the ballroom with a wave of cruelty. Some guests clapped their hands against the tables, others leaned back in their chairs with howls of amusement, and the cousin basked in the sound of their approval. To him, it was just a joke, a punchline delivered at the perfect moment. But to those who had watched the groom's mother endure all evening, it was a dagger driven deeper than any before. The groom's body went rigid, his jaw clenched, his fists tight against the table. He felt humiliation crash over him, not for himself, but for the woman who had given him everything, the woman who had raised him with nothing but love and sacrifice. He pushed back his chair, the scrape loud against the polished floor, and strode quickly out of the ballroom, his chest heaving with rage. The bride called after him softly, but he did not stop, his anger too heavy to contain. Gasps and murmurs followed him out, some guests whispering that the joke had gone too far, others nervously laughing to cover the discomfort. The cousin, suddenly aware of the tension he had created, tried to recover with another laugh, muttering that it was all in good fun, but the damage was done. Every eye turned toward the groom's mother. She sat still for a moment, the weight of the room pressing down on her, the echoes of laughter still ringing. Her son's absence left a hollow space at the table, but she did not shrink beneath the stares. Slowly, deliberately, she rose from her chair. The movement was not rushed, not defensive, but measured, as though she carried the weight of generations in her posture. The room quieted, laughter dying into silence, eyes following her as she stood with calm dignity. She did not grab the microphone, she did not shout or curse or lash out. She simply stood with her back straight and her chin lifted. The cousin who had made the joke suddenly looked small, his smirk faltering under the gravity of her presence. For the first time that evening, the bride's relatives seemed unsettled, their arrogance wavering as they realized their cruelty had not broken her. Instead, it had awakened something steadier, something unshakable. The bride sat frozen, her eyes wide, torn between shame for her family and awe for the woman who now commanded the room without a word. She felt her stomach twist, realizing too late that the silence she had kept all evening had allowed this cruelty to fester, to grow unchecked until it had exploded in public humiliation. Now, her mother-in-law's calm defiance stood as a mirror to her own inaction. Guests from the groom's side exchanged glances, their pride swelling at the sight of her strength. They had known her resilience, her quiet endurance, but tonight she revealed a different kind of power, one born from decades of survival and dignity. They whispered among themselves that the bride's family had underestimated her, that they had mistaken silence for weakness, but the truth was now undeniable. The groom's mother scanned the room, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. She did not need to speak for the weight of her presence to settle over everyone. Those who had laughed now avoided her eyes, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Those who had mocked her earlier in the night felt the sting of shame creep along their skin. Even those who had remained silent felt the heaviness of her dignity, as though they too had been complicit in the cruelty. The cousin at the microphone coughed awkwardly, muttered something about moving on, and hurried away, his arrogance deflating like a balloon. The MC, sensing the discomfort, quickly introduced the next speaker, but the atmosphere had changed. The room no longer belonged to the bride's family and their boasts. It belonged to the woman who had stood silently all night and finally risen, not with words, but with presence. Outside, the groom paced back and forth, his heart pounding, his mind racing. The groom still had not returned from outside, where he paced in the cool night air, breathing hard and steadying himself against the rage that threatened to consume him. Inside, the bride's relatives tried to fill the air with nervous chatter, their arrogance shaken but not extinguished. Glasses clinked, forced laughter spilled, and yet every glance eventually drifted back toward the woman in the old faded dress who had taken control of the evening without raising her voice. It was in this charged atmosphere that a voice broke through, not mocking, not arrogant, but filled with curiosity and authority. A man seated near the front, a guest who had remained quiet all evening, leaned forward and asked if he might say a few words. He was introduced as Dr. Lewis, an art historian from New York, a friend of the bride's family, but also a man whose life had been spent studying textiles, design, and African American cultural history. His reputation carried weight, and when he spoke, the room listened. He walked toward the groom's mother slowly, his eyes never leaving the fabric of her dress. When he reached her table, he asked politely if he might look closer. She hesitated, her lips pressed tightly, but finally she gave a small nod. He bent slightly, examining the embroidery that curved across the bodice and down the sleeves, his fingers careful not to touch, but his eyes sharp with recognition. He straightened and turned to the room. "I have seen this pattern before," he said firmly, his voice carrying across the ballroom. "In fact, I have only ever seen it once. It was displayed in a Harlem museum years ago, part of a collection highlighting the artistry of black seamstresses during the Harlem Renaissance. The stitching, the metallic threads, the design, it is identical. This dress is not ordinary. It is a piece of history." The room gasped, a wave of murmurs rushing like water over stone. The bride's relatives shifted in their seats, their smirks collapsing into confusion, their arrogance buckling under the weight of his words. The groom's mother sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes lowered. She had spent the entire evening enduring insult after insult, shielding her son from his own fury, bearing the weight of cruelty without response. But now the truth had been forced into the open by someone who recognized what others could not see. She lifted her head slowly, her gaze steady, her voice quiet but strong. "It belonged to my grandmother," she said at last. "She was a seamstress in Harlem in the 1930s. She worked for families who were building their futures, leaders of our community, men and women who carried themselves with pride when the world wanted to break them down. She stitched gowns for women who walked into ballrooms and claimed space in a society that told them they had none. She stitched dignity into fabric, hope into every seam. This dress was hers, and it has been passed down through our family ever since." Her words cut through the room sharper than any insult, sharper than any laughter, and the weight of history settled like a mantle over the night. Those who had mocked her fell silent, their faces flushed with shame. Those who had remained quiet leaned forward, drawn by the gravity of her revelation. And those who had always known her strength nodded, their hearts swelling with pride that the truth had finally been spoken aloud. Dr. Lewis nodded vigorously, confirming every word. He explained how seamstresses during the Harlem Renaissance were often overlooked, their work hidden behind the glamour of the women who wore their gowns, but in truth, they were artists who carried stories of resilience, pride, and cultural identity in every piece they created. "This is not just a dress," he said with conviction. "It is a symbol of survival, of artistry, of a legacy that endures even now. To mock it is to mock the history of a people who built beauty from nothing, who endured indignity and still created something magnificent. The groom's mother listened, her eyes glistening but her expression calm. She had not wanted this night to be about her. She had not wanted to reveal the history of the dress under the glare of cruelty, but when forced to, she did so with dignity. She knew the power of her grandmother's hands, the strength woven into every stitch, and tonight those stitches had spoken louder than arrogance. Outside, the groom paused as a ripple of applause drifted through the doors. He turned, frowning, uncertain of what had changed. He walked slowly back inside, his anger still simmering, but his curiosity now piqued. As he stepped into the ballroom, he saw his mother standing tall, the historian beside her, the guests leaning forward in awe, and his bride watching with wide eyes. He stopped, stunned by the scene, and then pride surged through him as he realized his mother had turned humiliation into revelation. The bride's relatives shifted uncomfortably, their earlier laughter now a stain they could not wash away. The cousin who had mocked her with the funeral dress remark could not meet anyone's eyes, his face pale, his arrogance shattered. The aunt who had said the dress belonged in a thrift store stared at the tablecloth, her fingers twisting nervously. Their words, once so sharp, now looked like the weapons of fools wielded against a queen. The bride felt tears burn at the corners of her eyes. She had stayed silent too long, allowed her family to shame the woman who had raised the man she loved, but now the truth stood undeniable. Her new mother-in-law was not a woman to be pitied or mocked. She was the living heir of a history richer than jewels, stronger than wealth, more enduring than arrogance. The groom walked to his mother's side, his chest swelling with pride. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder, his eyes shining as he looked at her. "You should have told me," he whispered, but she only shook her head. "It wasn't time," she said softly. The ballroom that only an hour before had been thick with arrogance and cruelty now buzzed with a different kind of energy, one of hushed awe mixed with disbelief, as if the very air had shifted when the truth about the groom's mother's dress was revealed. Guests whispered in small groups, leaning close to one another with eyes wide, their voices rising in shock as they repeated what the art historian had said. The bride's relatives, who had been so bold in their mockery, now shrank back into their chairs, their smug laughter replaced by uneasy silence, their arrogance collapsing under the weight of history. Dr. Lewis, the historian, was not finished. He turned toward the crowd, his voice steady but charged with excitement, and declared that the dress was not only a cultural artifact, but also a priceless piece of American history. "This is a gown from the Harlem Renaissance era," he explained, his words sharp enough to cut through every whisper. The embroidery, the metallic thread, the design itself, it all points to a time when black artisans and seamstresses created works of art that rivaled anything produced in Paris or Milan. Most of these pieces were lost or destroyed, but this dress survived. Do you understand what that means? This is not just fabric. This is heritage, and it could easily be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars if properly authenticated. The room gasped as though one sound had been pulled from every throat at once. The dollar amount seemed to reverberate against the walls, clashing with the opulence of the chandeliers, shaking the certainty of those who had dismissed the dress as worthless. The bride's family exchanged nervous glances, their earlier comments about thrift stores and funerals now hanging over them like a noose. Some guests covered their mouths in shock. Others pulled out their phones instinctively, already searching for information about Harlem Renaissance textiles. Desperate to confirm what they were hearing, Dr. Lewis continued, his voice unwavering, his eyes locked on the threads that shimmered faintly beneath the ballroom lights. "What makes this even rarer," he said, "is the silver thread woven into the lining. That thread was imported from Europe during the early 1900s, accessible only to the wealthiest patrons and only entrusted to the most skilled seamstresses. Few had the talent to work with it because it frayed easily and could not be resewn if broken. This seamstress, this grandmother you speak of, was not just a worker. She was an artist, trusted by the leaders of her time, and this gown is proof of her genius." The groom's mother sat still, her eyes soft but her posture unyielding, as though she had known this moment might come but had not expected it tonight. She looked neither proud nor ashamed, only calm, carrying the weight of her grandmother's legacy with quiet steadiness. She had never flaunted it, never needed to. To her, it was not about wealth or recognition, but about remembrance, about keeping alive the spirit of a woman who had stitched dignity into cloth when the world wanted to deny it. Yet even she could not ignore the power of the historian's words. Her son, standing beside her now, felt his throat tighten. The rage that had burned in him earlier was gone, replaced by awe and pride so heavy it nearly brought him to tears. He looked at his mother not just as the woman who had raised him, but as the heir to a legacy greater than he had ever imagined. A legacy that others had mocked because they were too blind to see its worth. The bride listened in silence, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. She felt her face flush with shame for every moment she had stayed quiet while her family ridiculed her husband's mother. She had been raised to believe that wealth and status defined worth, but in that moment she realized how shallow those lessons had been. The woman she had allowed to be mocked was carrying something more valuable than anything her family could buy. The irony was brutal. The relatives who had boasted about the expense of the wedding, who had pointed proudly at the imported flowers and towering cake, now sat red-faced, realizing that the most valuable object in the room was the very dress they had dismissed as worthless. Their laughter now seemed hollow, their arrogance pitiful, their wealth insignificant in the presence of a gown that carried both history and immeasurable value. One uncle muttered under his breath that it could not be true, that no old dress could possibly be worth that much, but even as he said it, his voice wavered. The authority of the historian, the details about the silver thread, the recognition of the embroidery, it was undeniable. Other guests looked at the groom's mother with new eyes, no longer seeing her as the poor, faded figure at the back of the room, but as the keeper of a treasure, a woman who had endured humiliation with grace because she had always known what she carried. The cousin who had cracked the cruel joke earlier slumped low in his chair, unable to meet anyone's gaze, his smirk long gone. His words about a funeral dress now echoed in his own ears like a curse, each syllable a reminder of his arrogance. The aunt who had sneered about thrift stores clutched her glass tightly, her knuckles white, wishing she could take back her words, wishing she could erase the sting of her own cruelty. But the damage was done, and no amount of silence could undo the shame. The groom's mother lifted her head and spoke softly, her words carrying across the room. My grandmother did not leave riches. She did not leave land or property. She left this dress, and with it, the reminder that beauty and dignity can be preserved even in the hardest of times. That is worth more than gold. Her voice was not loud, but it was powerful, filled with the weight of truth. The room no longer belonged to the bride's family or their boasts about luxury and class. It now belonged to the truth stitched into the faded dress they had laughed at all evening. The historian's words still echoed against the marble walls, reminding every guest that the garment they had dismissed as thrift store fabric or funeral attire was in fact a priceless artifact, a legacy of artistry and survival from the Harlem Renaissance. The knowledge spread like fire, igniting whispers at every table, each one heavier than the last. Hundreds of thousands, some repeated in disbelief, a piece of history, others murmured with awe. Every repetition carried weight, pressing down harder on those who had mocked without mercy. Faces flushed red, eyes darted nervously, and the arrogant postures of the bride's relatives collapsed into shrinking shoulders and bowed heads. The cruel laughter they had unleashed earlier now hung in the air like smoke, impossible to clear, every chuckle remembered, every insult magnified by the revelation of what they had scorned. Guests began to look at them differently, their stares sharp, their silence condemning, as though the room itself demanded accountability. The groom, who had paced outside earlier in fury, now stood tall beside his mother, his anger transformed into a clarity sharper than any blade. He looked at each relative who had mocked her, his eyes steady and unflinching, his voice calm but filled with power as he spoke. All night you laughed at her, he said, each word deliberate. All night you mocked the dress she chose, the woman who raised me, the sacrifices she made. You called it worthless, you called it shameful, you called her names that showed nothing but your own ignorance. And yet the dress you scorned has more worth than all the jewels you wear tonight, because it carries history, dignity, and a legacy none of you can buy. His words sliced through the silence, every person in the room frozen in place, their eyes wide, their shame deepening. Some shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, others looked down at their plates, but none could deny the truth. His mother had endured their cruelty with grace, and now the very thing they mocked stood as proof of their arrogance. The bride sat with tears streaming down her face, unable to hold them back any longer. She had remained silent while her family tore into the woman who had raised her husband, too afraid to confront them, too afraid to break the fragile image of harmony. But now the shame overwhelmed her, her shoulders shaking as she wept openly. "I should have stopped them," she whispered through sobs. "I should have spoken up." Her groom turned to her, his expression softened but firm. "Yes," he said quietly, "you should have." His honesty cut deep, but it was not cruelty, it was truth. She buried her face in her hands, trembling with the weight of her family's disgrace and her own silence. Around the room, the guests continued to murmur, their whispers now judgments turned against the bride's side. "They mocked her all night," someone said with disdain. "Arrogant fools," another muttered. The social tide had turned, and the family that once believed they controlled the night now sat condemned in the court of public opinion. Every guest knew what had happened. Every guest remembered the sneers, the cruel laughter, the arrogant boasts. The bride's relatives shifted uncomfortably, trying to recover, some offering weak apologies that fell flat in the thick air of shame. The cousin who had made the funeral dress joke opened his mouth to speak, but quickly closed it again when he saw the groom's unyielding eyes. The aunt who had declared the dress belonged in a thrift store dabbed nervously at her forehead with a napkin, her earlier smugness gone. They had no defense, no excuse, because the truth was laid bare before them, undeniable and heavy. The historian remained near the groom's mother, his presence lending further authority to the revelation. He spoke again, quieter this time, but still heard by all. "You mocked something you did not understand," he said gravely. "But history has a way of humbling arrogance. This dress deserves respect, and so does the woman who carries it." The groom's mother sat in silence, her face serene, her hands folded in her lap. She had not needed to defend herself. She had not needed to fight their cruelty because the truth had spoken for her. She looked across the room, her eyes calm, her gaze steady, and in that moment she seemed taller, stronger, as though the legacy of her grandmother stood behind her. The bride's family could not look at her. Their eyes stayed down, their shame written in every line of their faces. The bride herself finally stood, her tears staining the silk of her gown, her voice trembling but clear. "I'm sorry," she said, turning to her husband's mother. "I let them disrespect you, I let them dishonor you, and I stayed quiet when I should have stood beside you. I was wrong, and I will carry that shame." Her words cracked, but they carried sincerity, and the groom's mother gave her a small nod, not of forgiveness yet, but of acknowledgement. Forgiveness would come with time, but tonight was about truth. The groom wrapped an arm around his mother's shoulders and faced the room one final time. "This wedding was supposed to be about love, about family," he said firmly. "But love does not mock, and family does not humiliate." The guests who had witnessed everything whispered not about the grandeur of the reception, but about the truth of the dress, about the dignity of the groom's mother, about the strength it had taken to endure humiliation with grace until history itself silenced the cruelty. The groom's mother remained seated, her posture steady, her expression calm, her hands folded as if in prayer, but her silence now carried a different weight. It was no longer the silence of endurance, no longer the silence of bearing insults for the sake of her son, but the silence of triumph, the silence of a woman who had let the truth speak louder than any defense. Her son sat beside her, his hand still on her shoulder, his chest swelling with pride as he finally saw what she had always tried to teach him, that dignity does not need to shout, that legacy is not built on wealth or arrogance, but on the strength to stand when others try to make you small. The bride wept openly, her tears streaking down her cheeks as she turned to her husband's mother again. "I was blind," she whispered through sobs, her voice trembling. "I let them hurt you, I let them mock what I did not understand, and I stayed quiet because I was afraid. But you are more than they will ever be, and I promise I will never be silent again." The groom's mother met her eyes, her expression softening just slightly, and she nodded, her words slow and deliberate. "Then learn from this," she said quietly. Let this be the day you remember that silence in the face of cruelty is its own kind of betrayal. Respect is not given by wealth. It is earned by how we treat others. The bride broke down again, clinging to her husband's arm, but this time her tears were not only of shame, but of awakening, the kind that signaled a change that would shape her life moving forward. Around the room, the historian continued to speak with guests, explaining the cultural significance of the gown, the artistry of black seamstresses who had preserved beauty in a time of segregation and despair, the way their work had been erased from mainstream recognition, yet survived through families like this one. Guests nodded with reverence, their eyes wide with newfound respect, their voices filled with admiration for the woman who had sat in silence while carrying a priceless treasure on her shoulders. Some asked if the dress would be donated to a museum. Others whispered about the incredible value it might bring at auction, but the groom's mother silenced those notions with a single statement. "It will not be sold," she said firmly. "It is not for profit. It is for remembrance. It is for my grandchildren and their children to know where they come from, to know that our worth was never measured by what others thought of us, but by what we carried in our hearts." The words silenced every thought of money, every whisper of greed, because in her voice was the undeniable truth that some things cannot be bought. The groom's pride burned like a flame, and he turned to her with a new clarity, one that would remain with him for the rest of his life. "They tried to laugh at you," he said softly, "but tonight you reminded them, and me, that legacy is not in jewels or fine gowns. It is in the strength to endure, the courage to stand, and the truth that cannot be denied." His mother placed her hand gently over his, her eyes glistening now with the tears she had held back all night. "That was your grandmother's lesson," she said. "And now it is yours." The bride's family sat trapped in their silence, their arrogance shattered beyond repair, their names now whispered with disdain among the guests. They had sought to elevate themselves by diminishing another, but in the end, it was they who were diminished, stripped of dignity by their own cruelty. The bride's father, who had bragged so loudly about funding the evening, could not meet anyone's eyes. The cousin who had made the cruel joke sat pale and shaken, his earlier confidence gone. The aunt who had called the dress thrift store fabric dabbed uselessly at her face, but nothing could wash away the shame. They had mocked what they did not understand, and in doing so they revealed the emptiness of their pride. When the music resumed, it was not with the same tone of celebration as before, but with something deeper, something reverent, as though even the musicians understood the shift that had taken place. Guests danced again, but their laughter was softer, their movement slower, their eyes still drifting toward the woman who had turned humiliation into history. The bride and groom shared their first dance, but instead of gazing only into each other's eyes, they both glanced often toward the groom's mother, as if drawing strength from her presence, as if anchoring their new life together in the legacy she carried. At the end of the night, when the lights dimmed and the guests began to leave, many stopped by her table to thank her, to apologize, to express admiration for her dignity. She accepted each word with grace, her composure never faltering, but in her heart she knew she had done nothing extraordinary. She had simply carried what had always been there: truth, legacy, and dignity. As the groom helped her into the car, he paused and whispered, "You turned the night around. You made them see." She shook her head gently. "No," she said, "the dress did not make them see. It only revealed who they are. The laughter revealed their pride. The silence revealed their fear. And the truth revealed their emptiness. But for you, my son, let it reveal your strength. Build your marriage not on pride or silence, but on respect and love, because those will outlast everything else." He embraced her tightly, tears in his eyes, and as they drove away from the glittering ballroom, the bride leaned against her husband's shoulder, whispering that she wanted to do better, to learn from this, to stand beside him in the way she had failed to do tonight. The end. If you stayed with me until the very end of this story, I want to thank you. Stories like this are not just about drama at a wedding, they are about what dignity, legacy, and truth mean when arrogance tries to bury them. If the message resonated with you, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss the next story we bring to life, and give this video a like so it reaches more people who may need to hear it. I also want to hear from you in the comments what moment struck you the hardest. Was it when the groom's mother finally revealed the truth of the dress? Or when the groom confronted the arrogance of the family? And tell me, where in the world are you watching from right now? Share your thoughts below, because this community is built on the different perspectives you bring, and every comment adds something meaningful to the conversation.